Hi, I'm Steve, and welcome to Sights Less Seen, where I visit those maybe not so well known places you may not find in the normal tourist guide. Today, I'm at Fort Scott, Kansas, one of a series of forts that were built around 1842 to protect the permanent Indian frontier. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, America had a problem: expansion. American settlers were moving further and further west from the original colonies to claim land and get their, quotes, piece of heaven. And why not? It was free, they were told. The problem, there were people already there, Native Americans, and their idea of whose land it was and how it should be treated was much different than the individuals arriving from the East. Presidents from Thomas Jefferson onward struggled with the solution. Then, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It authorized him to give land west of the Mississippi River to native tribes in exchange for their lands in the East. The United States would forever secure and guarantee this land to them, and their heirs or successors, provide compensation for the improvements upon their eastern lands, and aid in their immigration to the West. The thought was, who would ever want to go past the Mississippi River anyway? The territory given can be seen on the map as the red area. It was a vast amount of land, spanning from what is now the Canadian border south to Texas and New Mexico, and from what is now Iowa west of the Rocky Mountains. In the 1830s and 40s, a series of 9 forts were built to ensure no settlers would move west of the Mississippi River and that Indians would not attack settlers east of the Mississippi River. These forts would, and I quote, protect the permanent Indian frontier. Fort Scott was completed around 1843, and it's about 100 miles south of Kansas City. However, the number of forts built was totally inadequate for the vast distances involved. And by the 1850s, land acquisitions in the West from other countries, an incessant influx of new people, discoveries of gold, and the desire to build a transcontinental railroad resulted in settlers continually moving past the Mississippi River into the territory. The government's policy to provide a large, permanent, and secure home for the Native Americans died, along with the forts. Most of the forts were abandoned. Fort Scott closed in 1853. It had lasted a total of only 10 years. Many forts at this time period, and in more peaceful areas, had their buildings centered around a parade field with no walls surrounding the fort. The field was used for drilling, parades, tactical exercises, and social events. Fort Scott has 20 historic structures, 11 of which are original buildings. The others are reconstructions built on the original foundations. So what you're seeing here is what the fort actually looked like back then. The site is furnished in the 1840s era, but its story encompasses 4 decades of American history, which you'll be able to read about during your visit. Obviously, the sick and wounded soldiers came to the hospital to be treated and, if necessary, stayed until they recovered. Keep in mind that the level of medical practice at the time, and you might rightly think that most patients may be here for a long time. Oh, by the way, this is one of the original buildings at Fort Scott. The quartermaster building housed the quartermaster and the commissary officers, each taking one side of the building. It also stored all of the materials for maintaining the buildings and all of the food for the soldiers. The bakehouse, or bakery, was part of a quartermaster, but was also tied to the commissary department. The quartermaster maintained the facilities, but the commissary provided the flour and maintained the ovens. This had to be a confusing and a counterproductive arrangement. It's interesting to note that in those days, bread was a huge part of Army meals. Surprisingly, it was required that bread sit out for 2 days before being eaten, as they thought fresh bread was bad for your health. This building is where all the administrative work was done and records kept. The commanding officer oversaw all post activity from here, including court martials, which, interestingly, happened in a separate private room. There were 4 three-story duplexes for officers, with an officer and his family occupying half of the building. They typically had 2 bedrooms, a dining room, a parlor, a sitting room, and a kitchen. The post commander's quarters looked exactly the same, except that it was a single house. The dragoon barracks were designed to provide a complete home for a cavalry soldier. It provided a place to sleep, a dining area, a laundress quarters with a laundress, and the laundress was paid 50 cents per month for each soldier that she cleaned clothes for, a place to spend free time, and a company office. The barracks housed a company comprised of 4 squads of 12 privates each. The company was commanded by a captain with 2 lieutenants assisting. These soldiers were trained to fight on horseback and on foot. The dragoon stables could house 80 horses, and these horses were definitely well cared for. Their daily ration was 14 pounds of hay, 6 quarts of oats, and 4 quarts of corn, which were stored in a hayloft in granaries, and each stall had a window to provide ventilation for a horse. Between 1842 and 1853, 3 different companies were periodically stationed at Fort Scott. Each company had a designated color for its horses. The uniform color enabled individual companies to be identified from a distance, and new horses would be accepted more quickly by the other horses. There were 3 infantry barracks at Fort Scott. 2 remain. They were originally for dragoons, but things were changed and another infantry unit came instead. The guard room contained an area for soldiers on duty and cells for prisoners. Soldiers were on duty for 24 hours straight. They would patrol the grounds for 2 hours and then rest for 4 hours. This would be repeated for the 24 hours. By the way, this continued basically the same way even when I was in the Army in the 70s and 80s. The cells had 2 types. The light cell, which had small windows for light and air, and the dark cell, which had no windows. It was dark and foul, with just a small opening for air. As you might suspect, neither of these cells was very desirable. Back in those days, discipline was very, very strict, and punishments could be very harsh, if not downright cruel. Minor punishment may entail reduction in rank, loss of pay, or confinement. Harsher punishments could be from confinement in a dark cell, standing on one leg on a barrel for a long length of time, to wearing iron collars or balls and chains while sitting on a wooden horse, like the one you see at the left of this photo. The armory was in the center of the fort. Here it was easier to guard and protect. Although the soldiers kept their weapons with them, the large store of ammunition was here. The history of Fort Scott did not end with its closure in 1853. In 1855, the buildings were sold at auction, and they became the nucleus for the town of Fort Scott. During the pre-Civil War days, there was some unrest centered around Fort Scott. Missouri was a slave state. Kansas was an anti-slave state. Fort Scott was a few miles from the border. Additionally, one of the officers' quarters became an anti-slavery hotel. And just across the parade ground, the infantry barracks became a pro-slavery hotel. There was some violence bound to happen, and it did. During the Civil War, the Union Army returned and Fort Scott became a military hospital complex, a military supply depot, and a recruiting and training center. In the late 1860s to about 1873, the Army returned once again to help stop the violence between landowners and the railroad companies who were building railroads across their land. The end of that conflict pretty much was the end of Fort Scott as an active post. In 1964, Fort Scott was listed as a National Historic Landmark. And in 1978, the city of Fort Scott, which still owns the site, signed the site over to the National Park Service, and it became a National Historic Site. Since then, a lot of reconstruction has been done, and it still continues today. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a comment. And while you're here, go watch my other videos. My name is Steve. I'll see you next time on Sights Less Seen.